I'm philosophy professor Ellie Anderson and co-host of Overthink podcast, and I'm introducing some ideas from the introduction to Beauvoir's quite lengthy tome, The Second Sex. I'm using the Malavani, Chevalier, and Board translation here. Beauvoir begins the text by suggesting that to be a woman doesn't mean to have an eternal feminine essence. And it's actually not just a matter of our biology either. The introduction to The Second Sex is really important because Beauvoir there lays out some of the central ideas that will take shape in the rest of the book, as well as situating her method, which is the method of existential ethics. She's drawing a lot as well on phenomenology, so we can broadly say that her method in The Second Sex is one of existential phenomenology. She begins by asking, what is a woman? A woman is not defined by her biology, because to be a woman means to have a particular social role in a particular society. Nor is being a woman defined by some abstract feminine essence. Beauvoir says that one is not born, but becomes a woman. And that's a claim from later in the text, not from the introduction, but it's probably the most famous quote from The Second Sex. It's for sure the most famous quote from The Second Sex, actually. And I think it's one that you see developed in different forms here in the introduction. For Beauvoir, the way we have to answer the question, what is a woman, is to look at the matter phenomenologically. It's not about the causes. Why is a woman, right? In which we might point to anatomical components, cultural components, etc. But rather, it's about women's situation. And this really picks up on a central theme of phenomenology, which is that it's a philosophy of describing the way that the world shows up for us, rather than positing causes behind why the world shows up the way that it does. And so for her, the notion of woman doesn't map on to female human being. Otherwise, you wouldn't have a bunch of conservatives saying women need to act like women, because they would already be women. But it's also not a matter of an eternal feminine, as I mentioned. And yet, women, Beauvoir says, exist. And she's not saying that they necessarily exist for all time. She's a bit agnostic in places about the future of gender, although in other places it really does seem like she thinks that there will be two genders in the future. There's some ambiguity there in the text. But the bottom line is that to say that gender exists isn't to say that it has a fundamental or eternal essence, but rather to say that the world is structured in such a way that genders show up for us and they have material effects in the real world. According to existentialism in general, human essence is defined by existence, not the other way around. And so for Beauvoir, there is no female nature, but rather there is a female situation. And trying to figure out what that female situation is the project of The Second Sex. Now, Beauvoir is sometimes credited with originating the sex-gender distinction because she emphasizes the way that being a woman is a matter of your actions in the world and your social position in the world rather than a biological essence. But the terminology of sex and gender is anachronistic from the perspective of The Second Sex, and indeed, such a hard and fast distinction between sex and gender for Beauvoir would actually not go far enough, because sex itself for her only has a meaning in situation. Our biology only has a meaning in situation. So going back to this idea, especially when she's writing in 1949, that when we look around us, we see that the world is structured on a gender binary, such that there are men and women. She thinks that we have to start by recognizing this rather than having a kind of gender blindness. If we refuse to recognize that our society is structured according to gender, then we find ourselves just fleeing. We are in bad faith. We're willfully ignorant of the actual material structure and situation of ourselves in society. This binary that we find when we take a look at the world around us, she says, is not neutral. This binary is such that women are inferior. And men make the fact of their superiority into a right because they look around and they see that they are privileged and they say, oh, there must be a reason for this. We must be better than women. And so for her, This is one explanation of the perpetuation of patriarchy and the inferiority of women. And of course, Beauvoir is writing this in 1949 in France in a bourgeois setting. This is different from the present day, and there are going to be different cultures that structure gender differently, but there's a lot, I think, that does still apply and some that doesn't. So this is a summary of some key ideas in the introduction. You can make of it what you will. She says that part of this inferiority is that women are marked by their sex, whereas men are not. And one example that I often like to give my students is pants. Pants are a form of clothing that both men and women nowadays can wear. And they actually seem unmarked, even though in previous generations they were designated for men. But skirts, a traditionally feminine form of clothing, are very, very much marked, such that it's quite a statement if a man wears a skirt. A lot of what we consider neutral in our society is implicitly masculine coded, but those things that are feminine coded are not considered neutral. Beauvoir uses the example of two poles, and she says that men are both the positive pole and the neutral center between the poles, but that women are marked by the negative. The basic trait of woman for Beauvoir is that she is the other. Strange thing is that women, as human beings, are free and autonomous beings. They are subjects, but they are compelled to assume the status of the other in order to conform to society. And they are defined relative to man. On that last point, you might think about the biblical story of Genesis, in which Adam is created first, and then God takes a rib out of Adam and creates Eve from it. So women are relative to man. They are a derivative of them. Beauvoir says that given this situation, it's really tempting for women to flee their freedom by taking up their identity as other, actually affirming it and saying it is my free choice to take up my status as unfree. And this would especially have been obvious in 1949 in the context in which she's writing, when many women were actively discouraged from taking up waged work and instead affirm themselves as sort of objects of their husband's affection in the home. And this would especially have been the case in 1949, in which Beauvoir says women were actively discouraged from taking up waged work and actively encouraged to define themselves by their husbands and to see the home as their domain, such that their identity is wholly wrapped up in being a wife and perhaps a mother. Now, Beauvoir's claims about motherhood in particular have been very controversial because she does suggest in places that it doesn't seem like a real vocation, but actually a way of fleeing freedom. That's a little bit later in the text, so you can check out the chapter on motherhood if you want for that. Now, another aspect that I want to draw attention to from the introduction is the way that she is using the philosophy of Hegel to set up what she sees as a conflict between the sexes. Beauvoir is influenced by Hegel's notion, about which I have another video if you're interested, master-servant dialectic, that the way that we experience others primarily is as a conflict. We're not naturally in harmony with one another, but rather consciousness finds it deeply, deeply disturbing to recognize that there is another consciousness in the world. And so our first reaction is to fight that consciousness to the death. So this is a view that comes from Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, and Beauvoir adopts this in the introduction to The Second Sex, as well as elsewhere in her work. Her first novel, She Came to Stay, has the epigraph, "Each consciousness seeks the death of the other," a quote from Hegel at the very beginning of the text. According to this view, the category the other is primary to consciousness. Consciousness wants to recognize itself as sovereign, and so it others whatever consciousnesses are around it. There is thus a duality, a sort of essential relation between self and other. And groups get their identity from their opposition to the other. They say, this is my group, and what is outside of us is other to us. Consciousnesses are fundamentally hostile to each other. And if we think about a group as maybe a group consciousness, then we can say that those groups are fundamentally hostile to the other. And this tendency for consciousness and group identities to other what is outside of them, she says, is a little bit unique when it comes to the nature of sex, or what we would now call gender, because it doesn't seem to have had a clear historical origin. Like, When was it that man started to be seen as the absolute human type and woman as the other? She says, we just don't know. But what we find ourselves in is this situation where we live in a society that is structured according to a gender binary, such that men are seen as the essential. They can think of themselves outside of their relation to women. But women are posited as the inessential, as the other, as relative to men. And there's a conflict, she says, this is going back to something I said a few minutes ago, but within women's consciousnesses, she thinks, such that they feel themselves to be essential and transcendent, but are treated as inessential and as other in society. Now, one idea that really interests me and about which I've written in some of my scholarly articles is Beauvoir's sense that there are two kinds of othering or two kinds of otherness. One is the essential fact of otherness, which goes back to her view following Hegel that consciousness fundamentally wants to think of itself as the one and to other what is outside of it. And so that's an irreducible structure of otherness that pertains to the phenomenological structure of subjectivity and intersubjectivity. But there's this second kind of otherness that is actually a lot more contingent. It's socially contingent. It's what I call, in one of my articles, socio-political othering. And this kind of othering is brought about by social structures of oppression. It, because it's not necessary, because it's contingent, should be resisted. And this is what she thinks the project of moving beyond sexism involves. It involves resisting the othering of women such that they are seen as inessential and moving towards a situation of reciprocity between the sexes, which will still involve this element of, oh, wow, it's kind of weird that you're a consciousness out there and I'm a consciousness over here. But there's a sense that we can actually take that as a starting point, but develop shared projects together and recognize each other as subjects in a mutual situation rather than trying to reject that otherness completely, even though it is threatening to us. Now, I want to go back to an idea that I mentioned a while ago, which is this notion that it's tempting for women to flee their freedom, given that social situations around them are sort of compelling them, or at least encouraging them to do so. She says that there's a temptation for a woman to become a thing rather than recognizing herself as a subjectivity and freedom. And in the introduction, she articulates 3 reasons why women may fail to lay claim to their subjecthood. First is that they lack the resources to do so. Second is that the bond between men and women, even though it's not simply a matter of biology or anatomy, actually seems to be necessary in a way that other bonds or oppositions are not. And when we actually look at the way that society is structured, men and women seem to be necessary to each other in the way that other groups don't seem to be. And the third is that women are often pleased with their role as other. Now, for this point, Beauvoir and her life partner and fellow philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre share the view that because it's really scary to adopt our freedom, we as subjects, people of all genders, are constantly tempted to turn ourselves into things because it's nice. And I think I put it in my video on Sartre's view of bad faith, which is really relevant to this point. It's so cozy to do so. It feels good to relinquish our freedom because actually taking up our freedom requires a lot of energy and responsibility. And so for women, Beauvoir thinks this kind of fundamental tendency of human consciousness to flee from its own character as freedom is especially tempting because all of these social factors from a young age are encouraging women to see themselves as things and to relinquish their own freedom. And so even though fleeing one's freedom is a possibility and a temptation for people of all genders, it is especially so for women under patriarchy. And I want to just end on that point by reading passage from the end of the introduction where Beauvoir says the following: "What singularly defines the situation of woman is that being, like all humans, in autonomous freedom, she discovers and chooses herself in a world where men force her to assume herself as other. An attempt is made to freeze her as an object and doom her to immanence, since her transcendence will be forever transcended by another essential and sovereign consciousness. Woman's drama lies in this conflict between the fundamental claim of every subject, which always posits itself as essential, and the demands of a situation that constitutes her as inessential." And really notice that word situation that comes up in the final clause, because situation is really the key to understanding the second sex. Beauvoir's background in existential phenomenology, which resists making causal claims such that womanhood is the result of nature or a particular other kind of essence, is really, really, really important for understanding the second sex, because it also shows how Beauvoir is diagnosing a situation that she thinks can and should be transcended toward a more just future.